Let's get something straight right out of the gate. The Middle Ages were not sexy. Not in the rom-com, candlelit-bath, slow jazz sense. They were greasy, hierarchical, full of fleas, and riddled with laws so specific and invasive that you'd think local officials were taking notes from behind the bedroom curtain. And in some cases, they were. Let's start in Bruges, late 14th century. The city's burgomasters think mayor meets moral police passed ordinances regulating how long a husband could stay in his wife's bed if he was known to frequent the company of other women, not whether he could cheat. That was baked into the system. No, the rule was about where he could sleep after. If he kept his boots under the wrong woman's bed too many nights a week, he'd better not come dragging back to the marriage bed like nothing happened. Officials called it a matter of moral consistency. The wife might still have to cook his stew, but she wasn't expected to share her straw mattress with a man who just spent the week rolling around in the hayloft with someone named Isabeau. Which brings us to the haylofts. Because in the countryside where privacy was a joke, and walls were often made of wattle, and whatever didn't fall apart this winter young couples were subjected to a courtship custom called bundling. And yes, it's exactly as awkward as it sounds. Picture this. You're a teenage peasant. Your parents approve of a local suitor, and the local priest says you're still a bit young for marriage. So instead of waiting, they bundle you up literal in sacks, blankets, sometimes a thick wooden board between you, and toss you into bed together to see how you get along. Think of it as a medieval sleepover, with a side of psychological warfare. There are surviving records of young women giving birth, while still unmarried, and the town saying, well, it was only bundling. Apparently, sperm knew how to climb sacks. Meanwhile, over in Paris, there's a 14th century law that prohibits prostitutes from wearing white veils, belts with bells, or golden shoes. Not to protect their modesty. No, that would imply anyone in the city had modesty left to protect. The point was to stop them from being confused with honest women. See, sex workers were legally allowed to opera telelicensed even, but only in designated brothel districts, and only if they wore the medieval equivalent of a scarlet letter. Step outside your district in the wrong pair of shoes, and you could be flogged, fined, or worse, accused of impersonating a respectable woman. The implication? Respectability wasn't about what you did in the bedroom. It was about where you were registered to do it. And don't get smug, nobles weren't exempt. In the Paston Letters, a juicy collection of 15th century English family drama, you can read the correspondence of one Margaret Paston, whose husband was constantly off doing wars and politics while she stayed behind to manage the estates and occasionally fend off attempts to marry her off to someone else without her consent. In one particularly spicy episode, local gentry actually stormed the house trying to drag her out of bed and into a marriage she hadn't agreed to. She resisted, in writing, with witnesses. Which, in a world without smartphones and hashtags, was as close as you got to a restraining order. But let's say you were married, legally, in a church, with a priest and a bunch of terrified relatives watching. That didn't mean you were safe. According to canon law, a marriage wasn't consummated until there'd been penetrative sex with intent to procreate. No climax? Still married. No erection? Possible grounds for annulment. And don't think you could lie about it either, because if there was doubt, the court could order an examination. Yes, an examination. By midwives, priests, or occasionally, if you were high profile enough, an entire ecclesiastical panel. It's hard to exaggerate how bizarre that is. The church had less interest in your wedding vows than in whether you could get the job done between the sheets. They were less marriage counselors, more bedroom referees. Consider the case of Edward II's niece, Eleanor de Clare. When her husband, Hugh Despenser the Younger, that Hugh Despenser was executed in 1326, one chronicler notes, with exquisite horror, that he was drawn, hanged, beheaded, and his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes. Why the anatomical flourish? Because Hugh had allegedly seduced the king. Not just betrayal, unnatural betrayal. So his punishment had to reflect the crime. In medieval logic, genital crimes required genital justice, a lesson that should have been printed on the town gates. Now, if you lived in a village under manorial law, and most people did, you didn't just need permission to marry, you needed permission to sleep together. The lord of the manor could grant or deny your request based on what was called a merchet, a fine paid usually by the bride's father for the right to see his daughter married. But here's the twist. Sometimes the lord could also claim droit du seigneur, the alleged right to deflower the bride himself. Historians fight over whether this was widely practiced or just a useful threat, but the fact that it was credible enough to show up in records says something. And it's not romantic. It wasn't just women being policed either. In some German towns, there were actual patrols known as Zuchtpolizei, or morality police, who could literally drag men from their lovers' homes if they were caught bedding someone before their engagement was formalized. One unlucky man in Augsburg in 1478 was marched naked through the marketplace after being caught with a cooper's daughter. The cooper, by the way, had reported him. Family honor was not a subtle business. Sexuality was weaponized, used to enforce rank, maintain alliances, or humiliate rivals. Consider the English royal court under Edward IV. His mistress, Jane Shore, was beloved enough by the common people that even Thomas More wrote of her as merry in company and without insult. But after Edward's death, she was arrested, paraded barefoot through London in a penance robe, and thrown into prison for harlotry. Her real crime? Being on the wrong side of a power vacuum. In Iceland, 12th century sagas recount what happened when a woman named Holgerður was slapped by her husband for stealing food. She didn't forget. Years later, during a siege, she refused to give him a lock of her hair to string his broken bow. He died. She lived. And the saga lets her have the last word. I do not care if you hold out for a long time or a short one. It's one of the coldest lines in all of medieval literature. Not because it's cruel, but because it's so quietly cruel. A domestic grudge carried all the way to the battlefield. Even monastic communities weren't free of bedroom politics. In one 14th century Cistercian monastery in Yorkshire, a scandal broke when Brother Thomas was found not only to be visiting the nuns' quarters under cover of night, but staying over. The prior defended him by saying he'd lost his way in the dark, which is a hell of a euphemism for spending 3 nights in a locked cell with Sister Marjorie and her illumination tools. Celibacy, like chastity, was less a practice than a performance. And medieval people understood that. They were deeply invested in how you sinned, who saw you do it, and what mask you wore afterward. A peasant could be forgiven for adultery, especially if it was confessed, wept over, and followed by a generous gift to the parish. But a merchant's wife who carried on with a priest? That was scandal, not sin. It showed up in court rolls, in detail, down to the location, the time of night, and sometimes the position. If that sounds excessive, remember, these weren't just trials. They were theater. 1393 case from York describes a woman named Marjorie, who did lie with John Carpenter of said city, being a man of the cloth, in her own husband's bed while said husband was out selling chickens. The sentence? 3 days in the pillory and a public flogging. The subtext? Don't mess with chicken sellers. They tend to talk. And yet for all the rules, all the fines, all the vigilante morality, the medieval bedroom remained a place of contradiction. A place where consent could be revoked only in theory, where rape within marriage wasn't recognized, but impotence could annul a wedding. A place where bedding ceremonies were observed by crowds, yes, literal witnesses, sometimes family members, sometimes the priest, to ensure that the marriage had been properly started. And a place where lovers still found ways to defy their stations, their lords, and occasionally their gods. Because underneath the laws, there were always loopholes. Loopholes you could crawl through in the dark. Loopholes shaped like human desire. In the damp alleys of Florence, around the year 1371, A scribe named Matteo di Castellano was dragged before the local court. His crime? Sleeping with his tenant's wife in the room directly above the man's head. Now, adultery wasn't rare in Florence. It was practically a civic sport, but doing it under your own roof, quite literally above your dinner table, that crossed a line. The tenant testified he could hear the bed creaking overhead, nightly and with considerable vigor. Matteo was fined, excommunicated, and briefly jailed, not because of the sex, because of the disrespect. In medieval logic, betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was spatial. And it wasn't just Italy. In England, borough courts were clogged with domestic disputes so specific they feel like satire. One case from London in 1369 involved a wife who locked her husband out of the house every time her female friend came over. He claimed they were sharing her bed in a way not consistent with sisterly love. The court didn't buy it, but they did fine the wife for improper hospitality, a crime that apparently included refusing your husband entry to his own home because you were having a sapphic sleepover. The judgment didn't care who was doing what, just that it was done behind the wrong door. Doors mattered. So did windows. In many medieval towns, you could tell a lot about someone's love life by how they handled shutters. A candle in the window might signal a lover that it was safe to enter. An open shutter on a third floor could mean, "My husband is at market, but forget to close it." And you might attract the wrong attention like the neighborhood snoop, or the morality enforcers known in places like Barcelona as mozos de moral. These were not gentlemen. They kept notes, crossed thresholds, and occasionally arrested couples in flagrante, dragging them from linen to law in under an hour. It wasn't all suppression. There were workarounds. Take clandestine marriages, ceremonies conducted without banns, witnesses, or church approval, technically illegal, deeply popular, especially among young couples and second sons with something to prove. In some cases, the only evidence was a promise spoken in a field or behind a stable, "I plight thee my troth," that counted. Legally, if they had sex afterward, the union was binding in the eyes of the Church of N. If neither family agreed, and no priest had heard a word, this made it a useful tool for eloping lovers, and a nightmare for ecclesiastical courts. You want irony? Here's one. The Church's obsession with enforcing sexual purity produced one of the most flexible definitions of marriage in European legal history. But if clandestine marriage was risky, consensual abduction was insane. A documented practice in late medieval Poland, Hungary, and France, it involved a man staging a fake kidnapping of his willing lover, carrying her off on horseback, sometimes with friends helping, and marrying her in secret. The idea was to create plausible deniability. If her family protested, she could say, "I was taken." But if things went well, instant romance. 1 part elopement, 2 parts felony, and a healthy dash of social manipulation. Sometimes the family went along with it, seeing it as a way to resolve awkward engagements. Sometimes it ended in murder. Medieval romance was rarely cute. It had teeth. And God help you if you got caught up in consanguinity laws. The Church prohibited marriage up to the 7th degree of kinship by blood or marriage. That meant no cousins, no cousins' cousins, and, occasionally, no one from your own village. If you think that sounds impossible, congratulations, you're thinking like a medieval person. The result? A booming industry in papal dispensations. Want to marry your third cousin? Pay up. Want to avoid the fine? Lie and hope no one rats you out. But if someone did rat you out, say, a spurned suitor or a bitter neighbor, whole union could be invalidated, and your children declared illegitimate. And then came the inheritance problems. Illegitimate children, by the way, weren't always left out in the cold. If their fathers were nobler, at least landowning, they might be acknowledged, housed, even married off strategically. But for commoners, bastardy came with fewer options and more stigma. In some parts of France and England, bastards couldn't inherit unless their parents later married, which meant legitimacy was retroactively possible. Cue the courtroom drama. Land disputes, feuding siblings, and lawsuits hinging on who, exactly, had sex with whom, where, and when. Imagine Judge Judy with more plague and slightly fewer teeth. Even language got weaponized. In Parisian slums, a woman might be called a moulin à vent, a windmill for her reputed romantic activity. In German cities, men who failed to perform in bed were mocked as Deckhengst cover, stallions who couldn't quite cover. Words bled into reputations, reputations into records. And once you were on the books as a fornicator, adulterer, or sodomite, good luck finding a guild that'd take you. The medieval world was obsessed with your bed, not because it was private, but because it wasn't. It was the center of your legal, economic, and moral standing. Even the bedding itself mattered. A well-made bed, with carved posts and feather-stuffed mattresses, was a status symbol and often an inheritance item. Daughters were bequeathed beds, sometimes instead of land, not because they were soft, because they were useful. A good marriage bed could secure alliances, produce heirs, and house the night someone slipped poison into your cup. Beds were battlegrounds, and everyone knew it. Let's talk about widows. Widows, theoretically, had freedom. They could manage estates, conduct business, and choose whether to remarry. But society didn't trust a woman with autonomy and a key to the pantry. So they were watched closely. In some towns, they had to wait a full year before remarrying, a period known as the widow's quarantine. The idea was to ensure no pregnancy from the prior husband. But it also functioned as a cooling-off period, a time to reflect, or, more likely, be harassed by suitors, in-laws, and priests, asking if you were ready to return to the state of holy matrimony. One woman in 14th century Frankfurt kept fending off proposals with increasingly elaborate excuses, finally claiming a prophetic dream warned her against men with cheese on their breath. The court laughed. The men didn't, because humor was a weapon too. And finally, there's the case of Margaretha Peter, 19th century yes but raised on medieval theology. She led a religious cult in Switzerland that practiced violent purification rituals, including spiritual marriages, involving bed sharing but no sex. One night, convinced that the end was near, Margaretha ordered her followers to crucify her. They complied. She died. Her teachings, rooted in apocalyptic medieval mysticism, survived for decades. A grim reminder that the legacy of medieval bedroom rules didn't end with the Middle Ages. It metastasized. It mutated into Victorian morality, modern purity culture, and every legal argument that still treats sex as public property and private punishment. Because the truth is, the medieval bedroom was never just a place you slept. It was where the world found you vulnerable, where the law got intimate, where power stripped down and climbed under the covers. And it's still there, in the fine print of marriage contracts, in laws about bodies and boundaries, in the quiet shame people are taught to feel when desire contradicts permission. We like to think we've outgrown it, but medieval logic has a long half-life. And the walls? They're still thin. Let's not pretend this was all just some strange medieval kink. No, these weren't quirky traditions born from harmless superstition. They were systems, reinforced by clerics, bureaucrats, neighbors, and the occasional hangman. Systems designed to surveil the most intimate part of your life and call it virtue. Because at the heart of it, the bedroom was never just about sex. It was about obedience. Who belonged to whom? Who was allowed to touch, speak, bear, grieve? The bed was a ledger, a confessional, a trapdoor. Take the public bedding ceremony. In noble weddings especially, in England and France, the couple would be led to bed in procession. Witnesses filed in. The priest would bless the bed. Sometimes the chamberlain would help undress the bride, while the groom stood there in his best hose and worst smile. Everyone waited for them to lie down together. Not consummate, mind you, that was usually done after the guests left. Usually. But they had to begin it in public, like launching a ship or sentencing someone to death. Because that moment wasn't about love. It was a contract activation. In case you thought this was a church thing, remember this. Secular courts were just as eager to poke their noses into your mattress. In 14th century Bologna, one woman was dragged before a magistrate because she was noisy during sex. Her neighbor claimed it was ungodly, and worse, distracting. The city fined her and her lover. The reason? Disruption of the peace. Medieval Italy, where passion could be prosecuted as civil unrest. Then there's the case of Agnes de Kelland in Scotland, who took her husband to court in 1345 for impotence. She described, in excruciating and probably rehearsed detail, how he lay beside her nightly, but performed not as a man should. The court summoned midwives. The husband, of course, denied everything and tried to claim spiritual torment. It didn't work. He was subjected to a literal test of virility in front of witnesses. Spoiler, he failed. Marriage annulled. This was normal. This was procedure. The law didn't care if you loved each other. It cared if you functioned. Which brings us to chastity belts, the shining symbol of medieval repression, and also, mostly, a myth. Despite what Renaissance paintings, Victorian collectors, and cheap documentaries will tell you, there's almost no real evidence that chastity belts were used in the Middle Ages. They show up more in satire than in court records. When they do appear, it's usually as a joke, a jab at jealous husbands, a warning about overbearing wives. Because even medieval people, for all their law-loving, God-fearing, bed-monitoring zeal, knew absurdity when they saw it. But that doesn't mean the control wasn't real. It just wasn't made of iron. It was social, legal, clerical. It lived in fines, in sermons, in the knowing looks of people who saw where you went after Vespers. You didn't need a belt. You had the whole village watching. In many ways, it was surveillance before surveillance, policing without police. And the consequences weren't always dramatic. More often, they were quiet. A woman shamed out of her home. A man denied guild membership because of a rumor. A couple exiled from their parish for marrying too soon after a parent's death grief had a moral timetable, and sex wasn't allowed to get ahead of it. And what about love? Actual, messy, unapproved love? It happened. Of course it did. A tanner's daughter and a stable boy meeting behind the stables. A merchant's wife writing secret poems to a Flemish knight. A nun in Rouen, keeping letters hidden in her psalter until her abbess found them and sent her to a silent order. For life. They weren't just punished for the act. They were punished for writing it down. Because stories are dangerous. They remind people that the rules are optional, that obedience is negotiable, that someone, somewhere, got away with it. And if they got away with it, maybe you could too. So the church cracked down on minstrels. Towns fined bawdy poets. Women were barred from playing certain parts in public plays, lest someone get ideas. In England, the maid's garland tradition, where a wreath was placed above the bed of a virgin bride, was used not just to honor purity, but to out those who hadn't earned it. Don't see a garland? Start whispering. It was a society built on spectacle, shame as policy, gossip as enforcement. 1,000 little mechanisms to make sure you didn't forget your place in the dark. And here's the final twist. It wasn't about keeping sex sacred. It was about keeping people predictable. The bedroom rules weren't just rules. They were maps. They told you where you could go, who you could touch, what your children would be worth, and whether your name would survive the century. Break the rules, you didn't just risk excommunication, you risked becoming illegible outside the system, someone the records could no longer account for. And in the medieval world, that was worse than death. Because the only thing more dangerous than desire was untraceable desire. And if you think we've outgrown that, go read a modern marriage license. Look at custody laws. Ask who still gets to write down whose body is allowed to do what. Then ask who's reading it. And maybe who's watching. From behind the wall, listening for the creak of the bed.